Or Edmonton, St. Albert.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. It is indeed a pleasure for me to rise and contribute to the debate of third reading of Bill C-38, the Jobs, Growth and Long-Term Prosperity Act. Mr. Speaker, C-38 will implement the measures announced in March's budget speech. My comments this afternoon will focus on several of the themes contained in that budget, and those are the need to return to fiscal discipline, reduce the size and cost of government, reduce deficits and eventually pay off the Canadian debt, which is in excess of $590 billion and counting. Mr. Speaker, certainly the Canadian economy is the envy of the industrialized world. With healthy job growth, a manageable rate of unemployment, comparatively low levels of debt. But this is not to state that Canadians can be complacent about either our debt or our economy. The recovery is fragile, and the situation in Europe is even more so. As countries in Europe, specifically Greece, Spain, Italy, and even Great Britain have demonstrated, growth in public sector spending in excess of growth of the economy cannot continue forever. High deficits will inevitably lead to higher interest rates and exchange rates, capital leaving the country, and higher taxes in the future. High debt mortgages our country's future and impose higher taxes on future generations who are forced to pay for the current borrowing. Mr. Speaker, this is the ultimate violation of the principle of no taxation without representation. And Mr. Speaker, I forgot to mention at the outset that I'd be sharing my time with the member for Mississauga-Streetsville. Mr. Speaker, several months ago I attended a conference here in Ottawa put on by the Manning Institute, Preston Manning's conservative think tank. The Manning Centre has published credible research indicating that a vast majority of Canadians are becoming less dependent on government. In fact, 66% of Canadians expect less of their government, except in core areas of government services, such as in public safety. Canadians are increasingly becoming more reliant on themselves, their families, and volunteer organizations such as churches, and as a result, they are becoming less reliant on government. Sadly, Mr. Speaker, part of this is due to their perception of government's inability to actually solve any of their problems. As Ronald Reagan once famously said, the 9 most feared words in the English language are, "I'm from the government, I'm here to help." Regardless, I believe that self-reliance is a positive trend. Stimulus spending notwithstanding, the cost and size of the federal government is bloated, and I would suggest is bloated unnecessarily. Between 1999 and 2009, the Canadian population increased by 11%, but the federal government's civilian workforce grew by 35%. Meanwhile, public sector compensation grew by 59% as compared to only 30% in the private sector. Now, Mr. Speaker, Canada is fortunate to have an outstanding civil service. However, if balanced budgets are to be achieved, all sustainable trends must be addressed. Any business which has experienced human resource shortages in its own business, and we have a lot of them in Alberta, Mr. Speaker, and they know all too well the competition from the public sector with attractive wages, benefits, and pensions adds to the difficulties that private business has in attracting and retaining qualified labor. We simply cannot continue to grow government in a way that we have been. Now let me talk about some specific areas where the federal government must engage in cost containment in order to avoid a system that becomes so expensive that it will eventually collapse under its own weight. Mr. Speaker, these costs are contained by measures taken in Bill C-38. The first is the old age security system. The old age security system is funded through tax revenues and is premised on there being enough taxpayers to support retirees. However, by 2030, the number of Canadians over the age of 65 will increase from the 4.7 million today to 9.3 million. 2 demographic trends are exacerbating that, and that is that Canadians are living longer and our fertility rates have been steadily declining. When OAS was first introduced, life expectancy for Canadians was 71. Today it is 82. Consequently, the cost of OAS will increase from $36 billion per year in 2010 to $108 billion by 2030. Meanwhile, by that same year, Mr. Speaker, the ratio of taxpayer to retiree will be 2-to-1, down from its current 4-to-1. This trend is clearly unsustainable and must be addressed now in order to avoid a catastrophic collapse of the entire system. Secondly, Canada must seriously look at many of its social safety net mechanisms given their increased costs and ultimate unaffordability. In my view, Mr. Speaker, no problem is more troubling than our current system of employment insurance. In Alberta and Saskatchewan, employers cannot fill tens of thousands of high-paying jobs, and are often forced to seek expensive temporary foreign workers to fill everything from skilled jobs in the construction and pipeline industries to service jobs in the hospitality and restaurant industries. However, as you know, Mr. Speaker, in other parts of the country, hundreds and thousands of Canadians are collecting employment insurance, many for parts of the year, every year, for decades. In fact, the employment insurance, by its very design, incents unemployed workers to do just that, to go on and off employment insurance rather than to seek out stable employment elsewhere. In the areas of the country with the highest unemployment, the qualifying period for employment insurance is the lowest. This, Mr. Speaker, in my view, represents one of the worst failures of the modern welfare state. In an attempt to reduce income inequality and regional disparity, the government has actually created a system which discourages human resources from moving to parts of the economy that are operating more efficiently. Those who can work should work, and C-38 makes it clear that unemployed Canadians are expected to find a job when and where it is reasonable to do so. Safety net programs such as EI were designed as temporary insulators from unemployment, not as a substitute for employment. Dignity is enhanced, not diminished, when reliance on EI is replaced by gainful employment. I just want to mention a word about environmental protection because much misinformation has been proffered concerning the government's concern or alleged lack of concern for environmental protection. Clearly, Mr. Speaker, Canadians deserve the cleanest air, water, and environment possible. However, Canadians also value jobs and a functioning economy. In fact, over the next 10 years, more than 500 proposed new projects representing potentially $500 billion in new investment will be under consideration in Canada. Mr. Speaker, as you know, currently developers undertaking major projects must navigate a complex, often repetitive maze of regulatory requirements and processes. However, by providing predictable timelines for project approval, Bill C-38 streamlines and rationalizes the environmental approval process. Again, this is key. Canadians should not confuse quantity and length of the environmental approval process with a quality environmental approval process. Bill C-38 will prevent long delays that kill potential jobs, investment, and stall economic growth for projects that do not have any negative environmental impact. Mr. Speaker, C-38 fulfills the government's commitment to practice fiscal discipline and return to balanced budgets. Mr. Speaker, although short-term debt is tolerable and sometimes even necessary, excessive long-term debt is incompatible with long-term economic growth. Currently, 30.9, that's almost $31 billion, or 11 cents of every tax dollar, is paid on public debt charges, otherwise known as interest. Accordingly, if we had no public debt and therefore no interest charges, we would be running essentially balanced, if not surplus budgets. Alternatively, those of you who are interested in program spending or social engineering, had there been no public debt, there would be an additional $31 million available for spending on whatever program is important to you. Governments cannot, Mr. Speaker, in the long term sustain economic growth through public spending. Keynesian spending left unchecked has not led to economic growth anywhere. Quite the opposite. Extreme public debt has led to crisis in Greece, Italy, and Portugal, economic downturn and political deadlock in the United States, and extreme austerity measures in Great Britain. However, some Canadians believe that we are somehow immune from such basic economic realities. Worse, there appears to be a real disconnect between government and the taxpayers that we represent. Fiscal conservatives understand that government has no money except for that which it taxes from its citizens and from its corporations. Fiscal spendthrifts erroneously believe the government magically, like fairy dust, has resources of its own and therefore can generously spend on all projects and all programs without consequence. But, Mr. Speaker, government does not create wealth. It merely redistributes wealth. It only spends resources taken out of the private economy. Government programs and public works can and do sustain demand in the short term, but they also monopolize available resources, taking them away from private business and resulting in the eventual slowdown of our economy. Accordingly, Mr. Speaker, the best long-term economic stimulus is for government to reduce its spending, pay down its debt, and let resources be allocated in a sustainable method through private investment. The great Margaret Thatcher once said, and I quote, "And you know, there is no such thing as a society. There are individual men and women, and there are families. And no government can do anything except through people, and people must look to themselves first. It's our duty to look after ourselves and then also to look after our neighbor. People have got the entitlements too much in mind without the obligations, because there's no such thing as an entitlement unless someone first has met the obligation. So, Mr. Speaker, the next time a member of Parliament asks if a certain program or project is a necessity and affordable, ask yourself two questions. Who is entitled and who has the obligation to pay? Mr. Speaker, you will soon learn that the answer is one and the same. Thank you.
Question commentaire, the honourable member for Burnaby Douglas.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I listened to my colleague's speech and intently, and I do have a question for him, though. So part of this budget is streamlining environmental assessment. And as I know, his riding sits at one end of a pipeline and my riding sits at the other end of a pipeline. I'm just wondering if he, like many of his colleagues, supports the new Kinder Morgan pipeline running from Edmonton to Burnaby. Thank you.
The honourable member for Edmonton St. Albert.
Well, I thank the honourable member for the question, and he knows that I represent a riding, the northwest part of Edmonton and parts of St. Albert, which is immediately north and west of Edmonton. And yes, pipelines, of course, are the conduit to how Albertans get its energy resources to market. So subject to environmental approval, and that's a key condition, subject to there being no adverse consequences to the environment. Yes, I support pipeline projects. I support Keystone. I support Gateway. I support any pipeline that safely and economically can get Alberta's energy resources to the market. Thank you.
Questions or comments? The honourable member for Bonavista, Gander, Grand Falls, Windsor.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. To my honourable colleague, I think the passage that I heard during the speech was simply to say program spending or social engineering. So the first question is two-part. Does he consider healthcare or even public broadcasting as two examples of social engineering?
The honourable member for Edmonton St. Albert.
I believe that healthcare is a service that Canadians demand and they expect, and that all governments are certainly inclined and at this point legally obligated to provide. When I refer to social engineering, I certainly didn't have health care at the top of my mind. As the honourable member will know, this government has formulated a new formula with respect to a healthcare accelerator that goes to the end of this decade. I forget the exact details, but it grows by 6% for a few years and then by the rate of GDP after that. So healthcare, I believe, and I think most members believe, is a human service that all Canadians expect and that all governments, including this one, will provide to Canadians.
Questions and comments? The honourable member for Essex.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I commend my colleague for his intervention. The budget implementation bill, implementing, of course, our budget, the jobs growth and long-term prosperity. I mean, the document's 490 odd pages. I would expect a budget implementation bill to be more than 12 pages long. And hidden in here, oh goodness, look, page 88, 89, 90, 91, 92, 93, et cetera, responsible resource development. Well, that was no surprise. No wonder, of course, it's going to be debated in a budget implementation bill, Mr. Speaker. Could the member comment about the importance of the responsible resource development and how it's no surprise we've been debating this since March 29th?
Here. Good question. Member for Edmonton St. Albert.
Well, yes, the Budget Implementation Act is subtitled Jobs and Prosperity and Growth. And certainly, as the member knows, and I think as most members know, the Canadian economy, although diversified, currently one of the big strengths of the Canadian economy, and certainly the part that insulated Canada from much of the worst of the recession of 2008, was the energy resources, largely but not exclusively located in Western Canada. So, of course, responsible resource development concomitant with environmental protection is a big factor within this government's response to dealing with a fragile economy, and therefore there should be no surprise, in my view, that that's contained within this piece of legislation. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
We have time, actually, for a short question and response. The honourable member for York South Weston.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'll make the question very short. Why, if you suggest that that Canadians want clean water, air, and to breathe and drink, would the government remove human health from a definition of environmental effects as to be studied in an environmental assessment? We only study now, according to the government, fish, birds, and species at risk.
Honourable member for Edmonton St. Albert.
Well, as I said in my comments, and I do thank the honourable member for his question, one should not confuse quantity and length of environmental regulation with quality of environmental regulation. One can have a thorough and complete and fulsome environmental debate in front of one tribunal as opposed to having a number of piecemeal tribunals taking a look at different parts of the puzzle. In fact, I would suggest that at the end of the day, having one comprehensive review will lead to a more clear and consistent result than having numerous, voluminous, and often repetitive processes. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Resuming debate, the honourable